This is Judaism Unbound, episode 486, Survival Guide for a Spiritual Wilderness, episode 3, Inviolable Goodness. We are proud to introduce the third podcast in the Judaism Unbound family of podcasts, Survival Guide for a Spiritual Wilderness, hosted by Jericho Vincent. We are the ancestors of the future. This new podcast offers a spiritual home for listeners seeking to connect Jewish ancestral feminist wisdom with their own svara, moral intuition. Each episode of this limited series delves into a different story of our ancestor Miriam, illuminating her mystical teachings and offering practical tools for navigating and flourishing in personal or political spiritual wildernesses. Survival Guide for a Spiritual Wilderness charts a radical, fresh Jewish path for its listeners and the world. We're thrilled here at Judaism Unbound to periodically feature episodes of Survival Guide for a Spiritual Wilderness here on our feed. But we don't only feature those episodes alone. Lex Rofeberg, that's me, and Rena Yehuda Newman, two members of Judaism Unbound's team, supplement each episode with some gemara, commentary, as well. We hope that our ideas will help spur you to form your own gemara, your own commentaries, and channel your unique teachings about this podcast and beyond into the world. Without further ado, here's Survival Guide for a Spiritual Wilderness.
A common feature of any spiritual wilderness is the jerks, the assholes, the villains. How do we relate to them? Our limbic system says freeze, fawn, fight, or flight. In my social media feed, there's a fair amount of fight, some freeze, some flight, and we've all seen a nauseating amount of fawn, the billionaires falling over themselves to prop up a fascist agenda. Ancestral wisdom suggests a response that's a little more complicated than these four options, a little more controversial. Heads up, it might upset you, but I think it's powerful and strange and intense enough to be a potent tool in this spiritual wilderness. In this episode, we're going to talk about 70 faces, checking biblical assumptions, Tehora Hee, it is pure, pre-prayer tests, Hitler's daughter, two villains from one of my own spiritual wildernesses, and Frank, and a practice for bringing Miriam's living Torah into our own lives. Content warning, we will mention sexual violence, so please choose to listen with care. There's a good chunk in here that is definitely not kid-friendly. I'm Jericho Vincent, your local feminist, trans, Kabbalistic rabbi, and this is a survival guide for a spiritual wilderness. Let's continue on the path. I'm going to tell a familiar story in a new way. Just a heads up, you might find it upsetting. It is said that there are 70 faces or interpretations to any piece of Torah. These are sacred myths. They can be read in endless ways. This idea that I'm going to share here, it doesn't negate the 69 other ways of exploring the same story. Last episode, we watched little Miriam sitting by the side of the river, using her hakema, her wait for what, to observe her brother as he floated in a basket on the water. She watches the basket drift towards a woman bathing in the water, surrounded by an entourage. This woman is Batya, daughter of the Pharaoh, princess of Egypt. The sacred text, it tells us that Batya sees the basket in the reeds, in the water, and she sends her slave girl to fetch the basket. She opens the top, and she sees a baby crying. She says, "This must be a Hebrew child." Then Miriam steps forward from her place at the side of the river after waiting, watching with Hakema. It's her moment to act. And she asks, "Can I get you an Ivri nurse, a Hebrew nurse for this baby?" When the princess says yes, Miriam runs home to her mother, who's grieving her dead son, and says, "Come with me. Your baby is alive. The princess is hiring you to be his wet nurse to breastfeed the child." I heard this story so many times as a kid. It's always told looking backwards from what we all know ends up happening, and so it assumes this air of inevitability. But let's check our assumptions. When I really put myself into that scene, it's very shocking. I'm Miriam. I'm standing on the riverbank watching my brother. I see Pharaoh's daughter grab him. Pharaoh's daughter, Pharaoh's the one who sentenced this child to death. He's killing all the baby boys. Pharaoh is like the Hitler of that time, and Batya is basically Hitler's daughter. It would not be my first thought that Batya is gonna scoop this baby up, save his life, and not only let him live, but adopt him as her own son. And yet Miriam steps forward, assuming exactly that. And not only does she assume that the princess wants to adopt the baby, she assumes she'll want to follow best practices for cross-cultural adoption and ensure the baby has some of his native culture, right? Miriam says, "Can I get you an Ivri nurse, a Hebrew nurse, for this baby? Because, of course, that's what you'll want." In this moment, when Miriam steps forward with these assumptions, she's demonstrating the third core tenet of her Torah, the third tool for surviving in a spiritual wilderness. We're going to call it Tehora Hee. It is pure. Tehora Hee, it is pure, is the radical, highly countercultural affirmation that every single human being has a core of inviolable goodness that they can always return home to. The name for this tool comes from a prayer that's traditionally said every morning, Elohai neshama shenatata bi Tehora Hee. Goddess, the spirit you have given me, it is pure.
Elohai neshama shenatata bi Tehora Hee.
There's no test you have to take to prove yourself before you say this prayer. It's taken as a biological fact of life that every person's spirit is pure. Pure, it means incorruptibly good. Every person's spirit is good, and that goodness can't be sullied. Well, how do we square this purity with how terrible some people seem to be? We can distinguish the core of a person's spirit from their behaviors and from the character that they build from their behaviors. Behaviors can be bad, and people can have terrible, ugly characters. But inside every single person, buried under however much gunk, is that core of goodness, that purity. In the Jewish tradition, the practice of making things right when we fuck up is called teshuvah, return. Because repair and repentance, it's a coming home to that internal purity that's always there waiting for us. I don't know what kind of reputation Batya, Princess of Egypt, had when Miriam saw her, but whatever it was, Miriam stepped out of the reeds and saw that core of goodness in a woman who should, by rights, have been her fearsome, loathsome enemy. And Miriam spoke directly to that goodness. Of course, princess, you'll want to adopt this child, and you'll choose a Hebrew nurse. Some people get really upset about this idea of Tehora Hee. They pull out the big guns. They ask, what about Hitler? Are you going to say Hitler had a core of goodness? To which I'd reply, yes, but there are two things that I want you to consider. One, if you say Hitler didn't have a core of inviolable goodness, a pure spirit within, that he was just a monster through and through, how can we hold him responsible for what he did? What can you expect of a monster but to act monstrously? To call someone a monster it lets them off the hook. When I affirm that Hitler or any other bad guy has this core of goodness, I'm affirming that they are responsible for making the horrifying choices they do, because every single step along the way, they had a chance, no matter how small, to make a different choice. The second thing I'll say is, as a rabbi, when I get this challenge, what about Hitler? I often find that with a little digging, the person challenging me is actually thinking about someone else who they have an even harder time believing has this core of goodness. Themselves. So many of us have a core wounding around our goodness. So let me be crystal clear here. Your spirit, it is pure. If you've messed up and you haven't made it right, you might have some bad actions you need to address, even bad character flaws. But no matter who you are, no matter what you've done, your spirit is and will always be pure. The mystical master Reb Nachman called this core of inner goodness ma'at tov, a little bit of good that's present in the core of every single human. And Reb Nachman teaches a complex and beautiful piece of Torah on the spiritual physics of taking the time to locate that Tehora Hee, that core purity. He says that we actually transform the person that we're interacting with in a small but real way, simply by insisting on the presence of that goodness within them. Now, this is a hard tool. We're in a fucking spiritual wilderness, people. The tools that enable us to not only survive but thrive are sophisticated. They're gonna challenge us. But Miriam is here to cheer us on. We are up to the task. I want to tell you a story of my own struggle with this principle, Tehora Hee, an ugly story. I'm not going to make it pretty. I'm going to be really frank. And again, content warning for sexual violence. If you've got young kids around, you'll probably want to put on some headphones. I wrote a memoir about my experiences leaving ultra-Orthodoxy called Cut Me Loose. It doesn't tell all of my stories, but it does describe how at 17, alone in New York City, abandoned by my family, I fell in love with a 24-year-old man I call Nicholas, who I met at the local park. I was obsessed with Nicholas, delighted when he took an interest in me, said he liked me. I was excited but nervous that he wanted to make out with me, but I didn't want to have sex. Despite my no, one night Nicholas decided yes. There's another story that I don't tell in my memoir that an editor told me to cut because there was already too much violence in the book. But in a way, it was even more consequential. I had one friend I trusted at that time when I knew Nicholas, one friend in the city. I'll call him Jordan. I met Jordan at the same park that I met Nicholas, but unlike the other men there, Jordan was never creepy. He was always kind. When I got locked out of my apartment, he let me stay at his house. One night, I fell off my bike and broke my arm, and he was the person I went to. As he very gently washed the gravel out of the wound, I fainted on his bathroom floor. I thought of Jordan as a good guy. Sometime after my relationship with Nicholas had ended, I went to hang out with Jordan. We were watching a movie in his room when he surprised me by kissing me. I laughed, trying to normalize the situation, shook him off. He laughed too, kept laughing as he continued his advances as if this was all a game. Kept laughing as he blocked me when I tried to run for the door. Kept laughing as he locked the door, threw me down, held me down as I begged him to stop. Kept laughing as he raped me. I lived with these wounds, along with others like them, for a long time. And then when I was 33, I met my life partner, Ben Ash. We fell in love fast and hard. Early on, we got curious about how to use our combined wisdom to explore healing our wounds. When I told Ben about Nicholas and about Jordan, he was surprised by how much monumental space these guys still took up in my brain. I was not surprised. I was used to it. I hated these guys. They messed me up. But here's a pesky phenomena that occurs over and over again in emotional physics. When we have a polarized feeling, a really intense feeling, we often, if we dig around, discover that we also have the opposite feeling. When I spent a little time in my inner world, I realized that some part of me still loved these men. Nicholas, who I'd fallen in love with at 17, Jordan, who I'd thought of as my friend. It was shocking. My self-reflection exposed that subconsciously I'd been ping-ponging between hatred and adoration to simplify perspectives. In hatred, I saw these guys as monsters. I denied that they had any goodness within them. In adoration, I saw them as infallible men, all good, no accountability, no judgment. Ben invited me to do something very difficult, to practice Tehora Hee, it is pure, to try on the idea that each of these men had a core of goodness and had made terrible choices, that I could affirm their goodness and hold them responsible for the harm they'd caused. Oh, that was hard. That was much, much harder than monster or angel. That required me to really face who these men were as human beings, what wounds might have shaped them, to look straight on at the fact that they had goodness within, but had made this choice to let their wounds and confusion take control, and they'd hurt me. Oh, there was so much more grief in this way, such a poisonous wave of grief. But I remember the feeling in my brain after that grief had moved through. The intense physical sense of poof, the ghosts of these men that had been crowding my brain for all these years shrunk into normal size, painful memories. That's a story about using Tehora Hee, it is pure, on memories. It's a different thing entirely to use it in the present. Every single damn day I open the news, I am challenged to use Tehora Hee, it is pure, in the here and now. And that is hard. It would be such a relief to think about the awful people in the headlines as monsters, to dismiss them in that way. It's much more painful to remind myself, Tehora Hee, they have a core of goodness. That doesn't mean I don't hate them sometimes. I think hate can be a very natural reaction to evil actions. But an excess of hate can eat you alive. Like a meditation, again and again, I try to channel Miriam's energy and remember that every being has this core of goodness. This is a spiritual choice, but it's also strategic. If we speak to the worst in someone, if we call them deplorables, we often bring out the worst in them, and we can ping-pong in an ever-escalating dance. I imagine a scene in which Miriam burst out at Baya, shrieking, "Don't you dare touch my brother, you filthy pig!" I don't think it would have ended well. Miriam offers us 5 tools for surviving in a spiritual wilderness. This is the 3rd one, and I think it's the trickiest. It's very advanced, very nuanced, and I think it has enormous power to help us survive and thrive. In the modality of internal family systems therapy, IFS, this Tehora Hee, it is pure, is called self. The founder of IFS, Dick Schwartz, writes, "Mindfully curious, calm, confident, and often even compassionate, that's the part I call self. And after thousands of hours doing this work, I can say with certainty that the self is in everybody. Furthermore, the self cannot be damaged. There is ample evidence that our negative expectations of others have a strong negative impact on their behavior or performance. The view of humanity that has dominated the Western world trends towards the pessimistic. Once we shift paradigms to the knowledge that at their essence, everyone is decent and kind, we can reorganize our economic systems, schools, and prisons." Or, in the words of the great Jewish teacher, Anne Frank, "In spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. I simply can't build up my hopes on a foundation consisting of confusion, misery, and death." Tehora Hee, It is Pure, invites us to root in the goodness always present in the world, even in the most barren wilderness. Most of us are not going to talk to the people making headlines for doing awful things. But in this spiritual wilderness, a lot of us are going to talk to family members or neighbors or coworkers who are supporting awful things. What becomes possible if we appeal to that goodness within? Again, not backing away from our clear-eyed knowledge of what is evil, but returning again and again, like a meditation, to the core of goodness that is present in each being. It's a painful choice, and it's not always going to result in transformation as it does when Miriam so expertly wields it. But assuming every person's capacity for goodness, that Tehora Hee, that purity inside, is a powerful tool. It can de-escalate us from a nightmare frenzy and bring us back to the much thornier but realer challenge at hand, back to a path through this wilderness. Let's take a moment to practice using this tool of Tehora Hee, It is Pure. I invite you to get comfortable in your seat. Feel your weight in your chair. Feel the chair holding your weight. Lower your gaze or close your eyes. Bring to mind someone who has hurt you. A hurt of a size that feels okay to work with right now. Remember what they did, how it felt to be hurt in that way. Feel your anger. Feel your disgust or your sadness, whatever reaction you've been having to this person. Affirm your reactions, that it makes sense to feel the way you feel, that your emotions are important, and you're going to take them seriously. Turn back to the person who hurt you. See them at their ugliest in the moment of causing most harm. Imagine that at their core, maybe somewhere in their upper chest, there is a spark of pure, sweet goodness. Tehora Hee, a core that is good. Some people find it helpful to imagine this person as a baby and imagine that spark of pure, sweet goodness coming out of their chest. And then fast forward to a more contemporary moment, present day, to the moment they hurt you, and see if you can locate that spark within, again, however deeply buried. The meditation challenge for you is not to erase the image of the harm they caused, not to excuse them, but to be able to hold the truth of the damage they caused in your mind with the truth of their core of goodness. When you've got both fixed in your mind, breathe into this scene. Turn your attention to your own body. What shifts for you when you hold this complexity? What feelings want to be felt? Pause my voice for as long as you'd like to be present with yourself. Imagine a river of purple, blue, loving energy, Miriam energy, flowing towards you and this person at a rate that feels okay to you. When it reaches you, it winds around your body, a cocoon of care, a cocoon of safety, tender, concerned about your wounds. When it reaches the person you've been thinking about, it feeds their core of goodness, which grows within them. And the person, in your mind's eye, starts to make better, kinder, more responsible choices. What do they do, nourished by Miriam energy? What actions do they take How does it feel within your own body to see this person who caused you harm making better choices? Stay with this as long as you'd like. When you're ready, thank yourself, thank your heart for allowing you to be present with these difficult emotions. Then use your hands to gather up the purple indigo Miriam energy from all around and compress it into a small seed and place it with your right hand, hand of compassion, palm down on your belly. Place your left hand, your hand of strength, on top of your right. Imagine that seed of Miriam energy that enables your spiritual chutzpah. Feel it rooting into your ability to chakema, to wait for what, moving down into the earth beneath you. And then feel that powerful seed of Miriam energy growing stronger, growing a trunk of strength that moves up your spine, a strength that is supple and calm, a strength that belongs to you. I want to pray for us in this painful moment. I pray, Mora Miriam, Ancestor Miriam, I'm grateful that your wisdom survived all these generations to support us in this difficult time. Please give us the courage and the strength to remember the Tehora Hee, the core of goodness within every being. Please give us the power to speak to that goodness in the people around us and in ourselves. And in that choice to speak to the Tehora Hee, may our words cause goodness to grow and flow in the most narrow spaces, that we might see our world shift towards justice, towards compassion, towards liberation for all. So our survival guide is growing. We know spiritual chutzpah, we know chakema, we know wait for what, we know Tehora Hee, it is pure. These are tools from Miriam's experience in the spiritual wilderness of slavery. Next time we explore the fourth tool that emerges the moment Miriam touches down in a new spiritual wilderness after being freed from slavery, where Miriam really steps into powerful leadership. Join us as we learn what tool Miriam uses to guide the people in a difficult time. It might surprise you. I'm Rabbi Jericho Vincent, and I'm so excited to take this trip with you, guided by the ancestor Mora Miriam. This is a survival guide for a spiritual wilderness. I'll see you on the path.
Walk with me together through this wild and stormy land. Walk with me, my friend, together. Reach out and take my hand. Open up your eyes to the sunlight. Open up your heart to the sun. Listen to the drum beat so steady. Together we can overcome. Take my hand and together we will walk down this winding road. Look around and together we won't fear what we don't know. Open up your eyes to the sunlight. Open up your heart to the sun. Listen to the drum beat so steady. Together we will overcome. Walk with me together as we cross this beautiful land. with me, my friend. Together, all of us, hand in hand.
Thanks to Ella Joy Meir for the beautiful original music, to the Kanfei Edges group, to my creative partner Ben Blum, to Moa Miriam for her guidance, and to Ruach Olam, the oneness within, between, and beyond us all. Survival Guide for a Spiritual Wilderness is part of the Judaism Unbound family of podcasts made possible with support from Lippman Camphor Foundation for Living Torah.
Thank you, Jericho Vincent, for another incredible episode of Survival Guide for a Spiritual Wilderness. I'm Lex Rofeberg.
And I'm Rena Yehuda Newman.
And as is our custom, we are excited to offer some gemara, some commentary on this incredible episode that Jericho shared. We've had 2 previous ones, so if you haven't heard those yet, we'd encourage you to go back and listen. You can also hang out with us now and just hear our thoughts on this episode you just heard with Jericho Vincent. Tehora Hee, this notion of inviolable goodness, that's the title of the episode. And we're gonna come back to that, about how it might matter to us, Jewishly and beyond, to really hold the notion that every human being has a core of inviolable goodness. Before we get there, we wanted to kickstart with noticing something Jericho mentioned towards the beginning of their episode, where they spoke about this story of Miriam and baby Moses and the daughter of Pharaoh, that whole episode. And we've heard that multiple times within Survival Guide for a Spiritual Wilderness, and perhaps many of us have heard it in many other contexts, this story of Moses being put in a basket, floating down the river, being saved by Pharaoh's daughter and her maidservants. And what Jericho pointed out was one of those things you hear, and all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, how did I never notice that? It's right there, but it kind of doesn't hit us. And this is a terrifying situation, and there's no reason that Miriam would logically presume when she sees Pharaoh's daughter scoop Moses out of the river that what was about to happen would end with Moses surviving. The obvious conclusion would actually be the opposite of that a part of Pharaoh's household, this evil, administration or whatever it is, that is in the process of killing or trying to kill Israelite baby boys, is scooping up an Israelite baby boy. And yet we read it with what Jericho described as an air of inevitability. We know that Moses survives and ends up leading the people to freedom. So when we read this episode, we sort of blur past how scary it is. And I think that that's an important teaching on 2 levels. One, the particular content of that story, that Miriam errs on the side of seeing the good, potentially, in the daughter of Pharaoh, and allows that to shape her response. Instead of screaming in protest, as Jericho mentions, Miriam offers, hey, there's a maidservant who's Israelite, maybe you want to have this baby raised by her. That's one teaching. But the other is a broader teaching about how we sort of do Jewish stories. And I think what it is that we often do ourselves a disservice when we know the end to a story, but are reading the beginning and middle. We sort of presume it is scary and bad if it ends negatively, and vice versa. Like in this story, if we know Moses emerges from this story unscathed, we read sort of a low-stakes calmness into parts that are actually very scary, and it makes us miss some important teachings. So I'm grateful to Jericho for unlocking those teachings, but I'm also curious, Rena Yehuda, to hear some of yours. So what do you make of this air of inevitability situation and how we might upend it?
Well, I think that I see this happen not just in Jewish storytelling and in not just stories from the Torah, but we also see this in the ways that at least specifically Americans think about history. That there is a real tendency to say, well, we know how this story went, and therefore it was inevitable that we were going to do these things. I think that it feels a little bit related to stories of colonialism, the whole idea of manifest destiny, which literally encapsulates this idea here, right? That it was inevitable that what we now call the United States of America was going to be colonized.
That's the destiny part. I mean,
literally destiny, right? And here we are manifesting the thing that was always meant to be pillaged, stolen from indigenous people, right? That it's so much a part of the foundational myth of America, this idea that history is inevitable, that there's this sort of one ongoing upward tilt or line about how history continues on forward, and that's actually a modern Western invention. The philosopher Walter Benjamin actually talks about this a lot, about how the modern era of liberalism really, really likes to think about history as linear and as inevitable. But in fact, history is not a straight line. If anything, time is a spiral, is a set of cycles, which I think is really actually
Yehuda, are you saying history is not straight?
History is certainly not straight. Time is a spiral. And the Jewish calendar is really, really enthusiastic, actually, about the notion that even though things repeat, they don't truly repeat, they rhyme. I think about when we look at these stories or these midrashic tales about Moses getting scooped out of the river, we see this through a lens as American Jews. That feeling that things might be inevitable is also a cultural problem that we're bringing to the text. It means that we just sort of see Torah as this inevitable story rather than Torah as being a live process that we are all engaged in. Because as it says, in the Pesach Haggadah, this idea that each in their own generation must feel as though they were personally freed from Egypt. We actually have to feel as though the stakes are that high because they really are. We're not just telling an old story that's seen itself out and that it's tired and it doesn't have relevance anymore. Torah is itself iterative, and we live inside of revelation at every moment. Every generation has new elements of Torah that have to be revealed. And that actually is a really countercultural idea in a cultural milieu and in like a broader American apparatus that says that history is inevitable. There's an essay that I believe also was turned into a book called The End of History by Francis Fukuyama, which basically posits that liberal democracy is the best system and therefore no other systems will ever exist. And we are at what he calls the end of history. There's nothing else going forward. Time is a linear narrative, and we will inevitably arrive at the best possible destination. And because everybody knows the arc of history bends towards justice, we can all just be super passive participants in the lives of the countries and organizations and groups that we're a part of. It is inevitable that things will turn out properly. Right? And I worry sometimes that is a misreading of Torah because of the way that, for Christian society that sees the Old Testament as quote unquote old, I worry sometimes that the story of getting to the promised land has become so ingrained in our cultural and collective understanding of how history works that this misreading of Torah as being something that is inevitable rather than iterative has actually damaged our ability to see what it is to be in an uncertain future. And Jews historically have always been a part of an uncertain future. What does it mean to accept that uncertainness without accepting that things like anti-Semitism, for example, are inevitable truths?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought in that anti-Semitism piece. I want to go there because it relates to this notion of inevitability. I mean, that word, it ties to French, it probably originally Latin, but inevitable, the able is at the end, but unable to be evited, but evit is avoid. It can't be avoided. That's what inevitable means. And so if anti-Semitism, for example, is inevitable, why would one try to upend it? Why would one try to create a world that doesn't have anti-Semitism? That's a fool's errand if anti-Semitism is sort of a basic part of the fabric of the universe and can't be defeated. It can only sort of be contained. That's a very pessimistic way of understanding the world. I also think it leads to very negative consequences. When you think anti-Semitic people or groups are quote unquote inevitably so, then your only option is to treat them as antagonists. And it's certainly not to notice okay, so maybe a group of people, I mean, I'm hinting very much at Israel-Palestine here. I should break that rhetorical wall that I haven't said it yet. If you think that Palestinians are just part of a story of eternal, inevitable anti-Semitism, as opposed to, there's actually contingent historical circumstances that when you look at them, it makes sense that a group of people that have lived the collective life that they've lived, Palestinians, would look at the nearest Jewish power and the one that has control over their lives and see it as harmful. And so then all of a sudden you can do things to affect that situation. But if you think that there's just sort of an inevitability there, you just got to throw your hands up and be like, well, that's the way the world is. It leads to that passivity that you're talking about. We had a moment on our podcast a long time ago where people talked about effing the ineffable. So the notion of an ineffable name, Yahweh, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, like effing the ineffable, like pushing ourselves to actually toe the line between the heretical act of saying that which we're not supposed to say and not saying, like finding moments where effing the ineffable, which is not it's a nonsense phrase, right? But we get what it means. Like making that which can't be said is an important spiritual act. I think similarly, we might say eviting the inevitable, and evit, it means avoiding the inevitable, avoiding the unavoidable. That is an important spiritual act. And we should do it in how we read stories. We should not presume that we know the ending. We should do what Jericho did, which is place us in the moment and inhabit the mind of Miriam. And, oh, this is a road with many forks. Pharaoh's daughter, we might call her Batya. My preference is to call her Tarmuth. That's what the Book of Jubilees calls her. She has many names, but she comes out and she scoops up this baby. We don't know what's going to happen. If we're actually inhabiting that story, if we're actually living the commandment of, we were slaves in Egypt, then that means we don't know how it ends. We're in it. We're not in the future that knows how it ends. In Miriam's case, she makes a really incredible judgment about how to act. It ends up paying off. I would also note that even after Miriam makes that choice, it wasn't inevitable that it would still go well. Like, we have the story where it did. Maybe there's a version where Miriam says, hey, there's a wet nurse that's Israelite. You should have her care for him. And they punish her. I mean, who knows? But it all rests on understanding that inevitability is not inevitable. It's avoidable. And also this notion of inviolable goodness that Jericho sits with. So I want to go back to you on that. I mean, there are a lot of political ramifications, a lot of philosophical ramifications for what happens if we presume each person has a core that is tahor, an essence that is pure or inviolable. Pure is a tough word for a lot of us, but like, how might we reckon with that side of things?
To me, I think a lot of it comes down to a sense of emunah. There's a concept of faith or belief or trust. And something I appreciate that Jericho really points out, this is not an act of naivete. This is not an innocent or Pollyanna thing to do. This is actually a really, really radical act of emunah, of trust, to believe that there is something else contained in klipa, which is another word for husk, or a thing that conceals holiness from our ability to see it. I'm a very theological person, and for me, the concept of Mashiach, the concept of the Messiah in a Jewish sense, is actually a really, really big part of my philosophy and what it means for me to be inside of this world. And I think a lot of people, when they think about Mashiach, it's abstract. It feels maybe perhaps a bit naive in some ways to believe that, that something or someone is going to come save us or have some magical act that makes everything okay, right? And my concept of Mashiach, I think, is not so simplistic, but rather the notion that there is redemption that can happen, right? That fundamentally you have this idea of ma'at tov, the idea that there is a little bit of good no matter where you are, that there is God inside of everything, and that can be liberated. But what's so wonderful about a Jewish perspective, and I think also a Hasidic perspective on this, is the notion that we have to do it. We have to bring Mashiach. There's a drash that says that when you get to the gates of Olam Haba, when you get to the entrance of the world to come, you're asked, not were you good, not were you bad, but were you anxious? Were you anxious for Mashiach? Did you want it? Did you want the world to be different? And that's actually the most important value. Going back to our friend Walter Benjamin, he has this amazing quote where he says, every second is a narrow gate through which Mashiach can enter. It's like the most radical idea that when we're living in these moments of absolute terror and we experience this drive towards annihilation or nihilism, like the belief that things truly can never get better, the idea that somehow every second has this potency is really extreme because it requires this ability to interrupt a narrative. And that's exactly what Jericho is talking about that Miriam is doing in this story, that she's emerging from the reeds and she's interrupting an assumed narrative about what is going to happen because she has this expansive idea about what can happen that goes beyond the potentials of terror of the moment that she's living inside. There's this brilliant and contemporary sex theorist, psychoanalyst, philosopher named Avgi Sakatopoulou, who writes on this concept of exigent sadism in the realm of sadomasochism, and thinking about how sadomasochism and kink and psychology all really fit together. That there are a lot of different kinds of sadism. That there's what we often think of as being standard sadism, which is just the simple desire to hurt somebody else, which can be quite antisocial and cause harm and damage. But often within a sadomasochistic context, when it's within kink, or when we're talking about relationships that are happening in consensual contexts between people who enjoy or experience a kind of excitement around sadomasochism, actually within the pleasure of that, talk about ma'at tov, finding something beautiful inside of something that otherwise seems like it does harm. There are kinds of sadism that can actually transform a person, to interrupt a narrative and create change. And so she talks about this concept of exigent sadism, which can happen both in interpersonal and also political contexts. And an exigent sadist is somebody who, in a desire to interrupt a dialogue, is willing to withhold themselves, is willing to do something that feels sadistic, actually. But that's because I believe I can interrupt a narrative and spark change and actually create an opportunity for growth. What happens when somebody who's a part of a marginalized group, who's within an oppressive power structure, instead of doing the thing where we're often saying, well, let's sit down for a conversation about it, where perhaps the marginalized person can educate the oppressed group or the oppressing group of people and can show them what the right thing to do is, or we can have a moment of repair. She brings into question, what is that repair that's actually being done? Do we want to repair the status quo? Was the status quo worth having? And it says, I'm actually expressing a trust or a belief that things can be better, and that the person who I'm having this interaction with can actually grow.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you brought from Avgi Sakatopoulou, and I want to connect that back to how we hear and relate to this phrase Tehora Hee, which, so in the context it comes, Elohai Neshama, this prayer in the morning, it's talking about the soul that God has given me, Shenatata Bi, but the soul you have given me, it's usually translated as is pure. And I mentioned before I struggle with the word pure. It's because of what you're offering. I think we've been taught to see things in the world and people in the world, isms in the world, as either pure or impure. And the word pure, like, I think it's pretty much impossible for an English speaker to not hear that as like sort of unsullied in any way, 100% impeccable. Like, that's what pure gets at. If you're talking about like a mineral or like things that are pure don't have things that are impure. Because if they do, we call them something other than pure. We call them like partially pure. And that's not a super healthy way of understanding things, because lots of that which we see as potentially harmful, when thought about and channeled productively, can be important and good. And lots of that which we might call pure or good actually has a ton of problems. And if we also classify people as good and bad eternally, it has that same inevitability function. It doesn't allow for a transformation. But I wanna read Tehora Hee, which I do think in Hebrew, like, it's not wrong to read it as pure. There is a way that is kind of what the adjective is doing. We could complicate it. I want to read it and tie it to another phrase that sounds very similar, that is one of my favorites, Torah Hee. There's that famous story in the Talmud where, this rabbi hides in a bunch of places, hides in a bathroom, hides under a bed. And it's often misquoted. It's often mistranslated. People say that, oh, the reason this guy is hiding under the bed of his rabbi as the rabbi has sex is, and this is the misquote, this, that is to say sex, too, is Torah, and I must learn. It doesn't say that. There's no gam, which would be like also or to. It just says Torah Hee. This is Torah. This actually has ramifications for how we live in the world. That's what, for a thing to be Torah to the rabbis, is to say that thing has an impact on how they would go about living their everyday life and how they would channel the values they hold in the world. That's what it means to call something Torah. It's not just like, oh, it's kind of like the 5 books of Moses. Oh, it's kind of like, no, that's not what it means. It is something we should be channeling very actively. And so I kind of want to hear Elohai neshama shenatata bi Tehora Hee, the soul that you have given me, God, is pure, as Elohai neshama shenatata bi Torah Hee, the soul that you have given me, or the essence that I am, is Torah. Once something is Torah, there's like an obligation to bring it to life in the world. And so all of us has that quest to channel our neshama, however we want to translate that, our soul, our essence, our something, our self, into the world productively. That is not a passive stance. That is an active stance, and it's one that directly flies in the face of notions of inevitability. And so I'm kind of excited about it.
And if we have a more coherent theology that doesn't just see God as all good things, because therefore if there are bad things in the world, we then have to have a concept of hell or Satan, which we have Hasatan, which is the adversary, meaning that there is conflict in the world. But that too is a part of God's creation. And so we don't have to erase terror in order to experience good. And we don't have to denigrate good in order to see that we live in terrible times. It's really, it's very non-binary to say that things are not one thing or the other, non-dualism. But thinking also about the overwrite of these stories and the overwrite of Miriam going to see Pharaoh's daughter taking Moses out of the river, and that we would say, oh, that's all just fine. There are so many examples of the ways that culturally we overwrite these historical narratives that damage our ability to see ourselves in the present. Many of the ways that the Holocaust gets talked about, there are even Christian philosophers who would say it's inevitable. The Jews just had to die for salvation. When we think about Christian Zionism, we see a narrative that says the Jews have to all go to the land of Israel so that they can all die so that the Messiah can come. It's an intensely violent philosophy. That feels like an incredibly dangerous and fatalistic narrative that I don't want in my liberation philosophy. The idea of seeing not just Tehora Hee, but Torah Hee, that all things contain Torah, including the very bad. It's not saying all the bad things are good. It's saying that all of the bad things are a part of revelation, and that means that it's live. That means that narratives and meanings are not set in stone, and it means that every moment is a narrow gate through which Mashiach can come, which means that these things are intrinsically unstable, and we have agency in that moment, instead of it being something that simply happens outside of our control. That feels like a very crucial piece of this at a time, again, where helplessness is such a prevailing emotion, to be able to believe that moment to moment we do actually have agency. And that a crucial piece of this is this seed that Jericho is bringing, which is the ability to see ma'at tov, the ability to see the potential and the good in every moment in a way that is not naive, but is actually pragmatic.
100%. We're going to close basically on that note. And the last thing I'll add is just, it's clear that this is hard, right? Like, and Jericho spoke about this. That's why we did this entire meditation exercise. Like, Rena, Yehuda, and I are saying that this is very important, that we understand all people, all isms, all things have both good and bad in them. And also, like, it is really freaking hard to look at the people that have most harmed us directly in our lives and who have most harmed those we love and the world we love and say, like, they've got a core of goodness in them. I don't want to suggest, and we don't want to suggest, that this is just like straightforward. It's a practice. Practice in the sense of going to basketball practice and working on your dribbling, working on your passing. Like, it is something you have to, and we have to work on, because inhabiting that philosophy that all people are good, especially in this moment where there's so much that isn't good, it feels nonsensical sometimes, but it is sensical. There is sense there. That sounded like a sense popsicle. That is what I think is necessary if we're going to bring healing to our world, is to recognize that there is something underneath the harm that can be healed. Like Jericho said, we're not saying that we shouldn't look at people who are doing unbelievable harm and have done unbelievable harm and say somehow, oh, that's nothing. They're mostly good. They're good. Like, it's not an ignore it. It's work to create a world where we can better unlock that goodness because we've created liberatory frameworks that allow us to function in community and connection to one another. So that's how we're going to close this conversation. We are so grateful to you for connecting with Survival Guide for a Spiritual Wilderness. It is already having a huge impact on the two of our lives and how we connect to Torah. I know it's the case for many others that we've been hearing from. So we look forward to 2 more of these Gemara conversations that'll be coming up in the coming months. But with that, we'll close things out and just say this has been Judaism Unbound.